we are about, I'd say, 2 months or so away from the NBA awards show. We don't know what the date is. We don't know what the time is, but the NBA has been hosting their, annual award show. This will be the third year for it in June, either before the finals or after the finals. Actually, with COVID, the schedule got all fucked up, so I don't even really remember when it was. So I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with this. My brain just straight up stopped working. So as a Nets fan, I'm gonna do my best to look at this situation and be as unbiased as possible, and just really quick rattle off all of my award winners just to make it easy. MVP, Kevin Durant. Defensive Player of the Year, Kevin Durant. Most Improved Player, gotta go with Nick Claxton. Rookie of the Year, Cam Thomas. Executive of the Year, Sean Marks. Coach of the Year, literally anybody but Steve Nash. There we go. And with that, we're gonna move on to the actual awards. I don't know if I should start with MVP or if I should finish with MVP because this has been the most vicious MVP debate that I can remember. Probably since Russell Westbrook's triple double MVP between him and James Harden. Every year you have two or three guys who are the finalists for the MVP, obviously, but very rarely are the races as close as people think they are. This year is one of those years where you literally have five or six guys that you could give the MVP to. Just off the top of my head. Embiid, Jokic, Giannis, Ja, Devin Booker, Luka, Jason Tatum. I just named seven guys, all of whom have an argument for MVP. Of course, the finalist is probably going to be, I don't want to say probably, two finalists are definitely Jokic and Embiid. And after just seeing how Giannis closed out the season, I think he's going to be the third finalist, especially since Ja went ahead and missed a couple of games toward the end of the year. Uh, I was really rooting for Ja for the longest time, and I thought he had a legitimate shot to win MVP. But injuries just got the better of him, unfortunately. So there's been a lot of back and forth. Joel Embiid was fucking crying on the timeline. He's like, I don't know what else I can do. These guys just don't like me, yada yada. Just like, oh, woe is me. It's like he pisses shits and farts on himself when someone says that Nikola Jokic might actually be the MVP, and he makes it seem like he doesn't have a case. He makes it seem like the media is downplaying his achievements. Meanwhile, it's a consensus that he is a finalist for the MVP, either the first or second choice for the MVP. And he's just like going on and on about like the media disliking him. And when you're talking about the MVP, the numbers obviously matter, team records obviously matter. But when you have guys who are so evenly matched, like Jokic and like Embiid, the numbers are you're splitting hairs at that point. The teams are almost identical, which I think says more for Jokic than it does for Embiid. But it comes down to the narratives. And I'm sure it also comes down to the media perception of these guys. I'm not saying that I'm the highest version of intelligence and that I don't have biases, but like I'm not gonna not vote for MB just because I don't like him. Do I think he's being a crybaby about this? I think he can go a little overboard. Yes. But I'm picking Nikola Jokic as my MVP because I think his statistical dominance is incredible. Just how he facilitates, how he rebounds, how he scores, all of this, how he does with such efficiency, and how his game has really expanded over the last couple of years. And more importantly than that, not, his historic metrics, not the fact that he is a once in a lifetime type player, but the fact that he, on the Denver Nuggets, accumulated 48 wins, which was only three less than Philly. This Philadelphia 76ers team that is objectively more talented than Denver, I think says so much about Jokic. You can also look at the advanced numbers. I'm not going to do that. I'm not trying to bore you guys with all the advanced metrics, mainly because Jokic always rates exceptionally well with advanced metrics. But if the Denver Nuggets were, like a 41 win team, a 42 win team, that's when I would have been more skeptical about it. Like, I'm not too fond of giving the MVP award to someone on a team who's barely above 500. That's one of the reasons why I voted for James Harden a couple years ago when the Rockets won like 60 games and the Thunder had 45 wins or whatever it was. But Denver was pretty clear above 500. And they've had some incredible victories over this season. They've beat a handful of playoff teams. Like, if they had Murray and they had Michael Porter Jr., they'd be legitimate contenders. And I don't know how that would impact Nikola Jokic's MVP odds. That's something we'd have to see if it happened. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And Jokic, I think, extracted the most out of all of his teammates. It's something that we saw LeBron having to do when he was in Cleveland that first time. And of course, the circumstances are different. Jokic had a lackluster roster because of injuries, because of bad luck. With Murray and with MPJ there, that team is significantly better. But LeBron had those because of an inept front office. And every game LeBron went out and was getting 10, 15, 18 points out of Larry Hughes and Zydrunas Ilgauskas. Very much like how Nikola Jokic is, elevating Aaron Gordon to a new level of basketball. And Monte Morris and Bones Highland and all of these guys who you didn't think would be contributors were, playing heavy minutes alongside Jokic. That was the sealer for me. I'm not taking anything away from Joel Embiid's season. However, the Sixers, as I already mentioned, did have the better, more well-constructed, more well-put-together team than Denver did. And they played very well. I mean, the East was super competitive this season. The fact that the leading team in the Eastern Conference only had 53 wins, I think speaks to just from top to bottom, 1 through 10, how tough the Eastern Conference was this year. They have no sub 500 teams going into the playoffs this season. Each team is at least 43 wins compared to the Western Conference, where the Clippers are only 2 games above 500, the Pelicans are 500,
Nope.
and the Spurs are 6 games under 500. No.
Nope.
Yes. No.
Nope.
8 games. Am I dumb? 12. Oh no, they're 14 games under 500. Oh my god. Whatever. 6 and 8 is 14. I was close enough. But like, every game is a bloodbath in the Eastern Conference, and I think the playoffs are going to be just like that. And I feel that Philly should have perhaps done a little bit better this season. I know they didn't have Ben Simmons, and I know Joel was out for a couple of weeks with COVID, so I'm sure that if he were healthy, they would have been way better. But they never really pulled away. And I know Denver didn't either, but again, consider the roster that Denver has. So, all of those things considered, I think that Jokic doesn't run away with this MVP award, but he earned it. And if you want to make the case for Joel Embiid, if you think Joel Embiid was the MVP, I can't argue that. If you want to give your MVP to Giannis, I can't argue with that either. And no, we're going to move on to Sixth Man of the Year because I'm going to forget this one. I'm 100% going to forget that I wanted to give this award to Tyler Hero. I'm going to show you what I was looking at last night just to try to, really double down on this. We're really just study them and make sure that I'm not overlooking anybody. So I sorted by bench players and I'm looking at it. I don't know why, for whatever reason, I thought it would sort differently. Like, it would sort players who exclusively came off the bench. And then I was like, okay, Jay Sean Tate, Dylan Brooks, Monte Morris, Norman Powell. So whatever. Tyler Hero came off the bench 56 times this season, which is more than half the season, which is, I think, the cutoff for Sixth Man of the Year. I remember in the beginning of the season, we were talking about Jalen Brunson and Patty Mills being in that race as well. But as the season progressed, those players had to step up and fill different roles. Meanwhile, Hero really had that role for the entire season. He was talked about as the Sixth Man of the Year back in November, and he's still being talked about as Sixth Man of the Year in April. Some others who are competing alongside him, Jordan Clarkson, who won the award last year, is really like the pure essence of a sixth man. Someone who is routinely coming off the bench and someone who is giving you the same level of production every time off the bench. Hero did start a bunch of games this year. I think it was 10, if I remember correctly. But even then, he was primarily a bench player for Eric Spoelstra. There was Kevin Love. There was also Carmelo Anthony, I saw mentioned a couple of times, even though I don't really believe that. Kelly Oubre Jr. is a name down here whom I just recognized. But I think that Tyler Hero as you can see. In these games, averaging 21 points, shooting 46% from the field, 42 from three, uh, 5 boards, 4 assists. He is a huge reason as to why Miami is atop the Eastern Conference. And him coming off the bench does give them that depth that I feared they'd lack in the beginning of the season. Because we go to Miami. They are legitimately 9 players deep. God, they're actually kind of more than 9 players deep. But in the playoffs, the rotation is gonna shrink. So Omer Yurtseven is not gonna play a lot of minutes. I don't know about Victor Oladipo. He might play some minutes now and then, but really, you're looking at JB, Kyle Lowry, Hero, Bam, PJ Tucker, Duncan Robinson, Caleb Martin, Gabe Vincent, and Max Strus. And having Hero off the bench gives them that safety net on offense because Miami can struggle with their offense every now and then. They're, top 10 in efficiency, but they're also a super slow team. They don't get out and run a lot. They're a little bit older. They do have a lot of athleticism on the perimeter and also in the paint, but Eric Spoelstra knows what he's doing. And Tyler Hero, being their sixth man, allows him to get a little freaky with his lineups because as long as you have Ty out there with the second unit, it almost doesn't matter. Defensive Player of the Year. This award, I believe Draymond Green said it best, but there really was no clear front runner for Defensive Player of the Year. And I do kind of agree with that because there were a lot of great, great defensive players this year. This is always a little difficult Defensive Player of the Year because grading defense in the NBA I find to be exceptionally difficult, more so than all of like baseball, for example. I know baseball has a shitload of defensive metrics that are quite accurate. And then same thing with football. It's easier to assess talent, defensive talent in other sports, whereas in the NBA, there is so much to consider that the metrics have not yet caught up to the level of the athletes. I mean, blocks are fine, steals are fine, deflections are a good metric as well, just to show you a player's activity. But with the rise of things like defensive win shares, defensive box plus minus, defensive rating or individual player defensive rating, these give us a new way of looking at a player's defense and evaluating players' defense. However, they are a little bit misleading because Luka Doncic in defensive win shares is sandwiched in between Al Horford and McCall Bridges. This statistic essentially means that Luka Doncic contributes to more victories with his defense, or contributes to as many victories on defense as Al Horford, which could potentially be true. I mean, if Luka plays a lot of minutes and he's on the court a lot, that's going to be factored in, but he's also on one of the better defensive teams in the league. So it is a little bit of an inflated stat. Also, historically, offensive players that bear such a massive offensive load kind of suck at defense because they're already putting so much energy towards it. But I'm getting a little long-winded here. I'm going on a little bit of a tangent. So throughout the season, we had Rudy Gobert for Defensive Player of the Year, Draymond Green, Jaren Jackson Jr., Robert Williams. Up until a couple weeks ago, or up until Robert Williams suffered that knee injury, I was looking at him like, this might be my Defensive Player of the Year. And it was boosted because the Celtics have come on so strong after the All-Star break. And his defense is such a huge, huge proponent of that. Because not only is Robert Williams a freak athlete, a fucking incredible second jumper, which I've already talked about in the past with him, when you have such a talented big on the backside, it allows all of the perimeter players to play a bit more aggressively because they know that they have their help. This is why we've seen Jason Tatum improve as a defender because he's finally able to use his size and use his athleticism to be troublesome on the perimeter. Of course, Marcus Smart's always been an elite defender. Jaylen Brown's always been an elite defender. But in the wake of Robert Williams' injury, I'm looking at Jaren Jackson Jr., who is basically the premier shot blocker in the NBA, is to the Memphis Grizzlies what Robert Williams is to the Boston Celtics. And with Robert Williams' injury keeping him out for the final couple of weeks of the season, I'm like, I don't see a world in which Jaren Jackson Jr. doesn't win this award. And maybe that's a little bit short sighted of me because he's ranked 10th in defensive win shares, and I don't even think he's in the top 20 for defensive box plus minus. He's not, which is insane. So again, this shows you how kind of weird the advanced metrics are for defense. But mind you, he's top 10 in defensive rating, individual defensive rating, which again is also a flawed stat. But he's also hard to ignore because he's such a prolific shot blocker, right? He led the league in blocks per game and block percentage and like all of those block related categories. I think I might be biased towards the Memphis Grizzlies, but this is another one of those awards where generally I and again, I don't believe this to be true at all. But when there is someone who wins Defensive Player of the Year, they kind of monopolize the award. You look at Dikembe Mutombo, you look at Ben Wallace, both of whom won it 4 times. You look at Rudy Gobert, who's won it 3 times. I'm actually just going to pull this up just so we can see. Yeah, Rudy Gobert has won it 3 times. Draymond Green should be a multiple time winner. I mean, Kawhi Leonard won it twice. Dwight Howard won it 3 times. Alonzo Mourning, Dennis Rodman, David Robinson, Michael Jordan. Like, there are so many multiple time winners for Defensive Player of the Year that it's kind of weird for us to even have all of this choice. Ultimately, any award that isn't the MVP doesn't really draw a lot of ire. I'm just trying to see where everybody ranks in terms of defensive rating. I mean, another reason I was going to give it to Time Lord was because Boston does have the better defensive rating of them and Memphis, but I mean, I feel like I have to keep it relatively consistent. When it comes to giving out awards, how do you take into account injuries for every award, or is it just the MVP? Because we're going to talk about what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about oh no, we're going to talk about Sixth Man of the Year, and that's one where it's like, okay, well, this player only played in 60 games. Do we give it to him, being Tyler Hero, even though he's been better than Jordan Clarkson? Jordan Clarkson has played in more games, so it's like this weird balancing act. But long story short, Defensive Player of the Year is Jaren Jackson Jr., Most Improved. Another award that is in particular very tough for me to give out winners just because there are so many players in the NBA and there are so many players who are constantly improving and improving considerably. Like, first to second year jump is one thing, but that second to third year jump is almost always more sizable for the majority of players. And with that, I feel that there really is no other recipient for this award other than Ja Morant. From year 2 to year 3, this kid went from not even being an all-star to being someone who's probably going to finish top 5 in the MVP voting. Just look at this man's stat line. 27 points, up from 19. His assists were down, probably because he was taking on more of a scoring load, but his rebounds were up. His efficiency rose by almost 5 percentage points, from 44.9 to 49.3. And even his three ball rose by 4 percentage points. To me, Ja Morant is now a legitimate star. And when this continues into his 4th season, I will have no reluctance towards calling him a superstar because he's even that now. Okay? He is so talented and so much fun to watch. And he's just a highlight machine. Every time this guy steps on the court, there are multiple plays, multiple highlight plays that he hands out. And just on the basis of improvement, this is one of those improvements where you don't really see it all that often. How often are players raising their points per game by 9 or 8, by 8, while playing the same amount of minutes? Not only that, it's not really the scoring that does it for me, but it's the efficiency. There are players who don't raise their shooting percentage by 5 percentage points from their rookie year to when they retire. Generally, a lot of high volume scorers will hover around that 45% mark just because they're high volume. And sometimes they have to settle for bad shots, whether it's late in the shot clock or it's because they're on a bad team and they don't have any other playmakers. Fortunately, Ja doesn't really have that issue because the Grizzlies are a very, very strong team. Dylan Brooks, Desmond Bain, Triple J, they have playmakers outside of Ja, which means that he can play a lot more freely. And a lot of that is the reason why they're the second best team in the Western Conference. And had he played more than 57 games, had he played, close to 70, I think that I sincerely would have picked John Morant to be the NBA MVP because statistically it's incredible. For him to be doing it at 22 is even more frightening. And you know, the records don't lie. You would have to give Ja a little bit of acknowledgement for finishing better than the Denver Nuggets. But that's not the reality. But the reality is that Ja is the most improved player from last year to this year. So he covered MVP, was Jokic, covered Defensive Player of the Year. It was Jaren Jackson Jr. Just covered Most Improved. It was Ja. Sixth man, Tyler Hero. And Rookie of the Year is one of the most interesting awards because it takes everything that we know about traditional award voting and kind of just throws it out of the window. Team record doesn't matter, health doesn't matter. It is strictly about numbers. And the reality of the situation is that Cade Cunningham from the Detroit Pistons was the best rookie this year. Scotty Barnes came on strong very late, but ultimately I'm giving Cade Cunningham the edge, and I don't think it'll be a unanimous selection, but I do think that he wins by a pretty sizable margin. And as far as Coach of the Year, I'm very, very torn on this award because on the one hand, you have Monty Williams, as you can see, who took the Phoenix Suns from 51 wins last year. Granted, it was a shortened season, to 64. They went from winning 71% of their games to 78% of those games. Granted, his roster was largely the same. And if I remember correctly, he wound up losing out to Tom Thibodeau. I'm torn between giving it to Monty Williams, who was deserving last year and is equally deserving this year, or giving it to Taylor Jenkins, who did what Tom Thibodeau did last year, but did it better. For Memphis to win 56 games, to have more wins than every other team in the Western Conference that is not the Phoenix Suns, with such a young roster, no one knew that they were going to be this good. Okay, we thought, you know what? Let's check. Their preseason over/under was 41.5. They were expected to be a 500 team, and now they are legitimate championship contenders. So Taylor Jenkins undeniably has a very strong case. I think him and Monty Williams have the two strongest cases. Do you give it to Taylor Jenkins or do you give it to Monty Williams because you have to give him some sort of acknowledgement? Now, Woj actually just tweeted that Monty Williams is being awarded the Phoenix Suns. Monty Williams, architect of the NBA's best regular season team, has been voted the National Basketball Coaches Association's Coach of the Year for the second consecutive time. So that is a peer-based award, I believe, not a media-based award. But I think that you do have to give it to Monty Williams. As much as I adore the Grizzlies and I think that Taylor Jenkins is a fantastic coach, the Suns were impossible to ignore this year. Even when nobody was talking about them, they were still the best team in the NBA by a wide margin. They had no skids at all this year. I don't even know what their longest losing streak was. Their longest losing streak was 2 games. 2 games. That is insane. That is absolutely insane. And just again, looking at this roster, D Book, Ayton, CP3, McCall Bridges, Cam Johnson, campaign, I feel pretty confident giving Monty Williams this award. And that's gonna do it, at least for this segment.